Good day to everybody. This is Jamie Lasssner, Executive Director of Friends of Access Israel, with a person who I met only 48 hours ago. And I know that this is the beginning of an incredible relationship with Friends of Access Israel. And our hope is that our guest today gets out and is becomes well known in the world because what he has to offer is tremendous. Today's guest is Professor Breandan Ward, a professor. You know what? Let's do this. Why don't you introduce us and tell us what you are teaching and what your goal is?
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for the invitation. So, my name is Breandan Ward. As you can detect from my accent, I am 100% Irish. So, having grown up in rural Ireland with my family, I graduated from college and pretty much have been away since then, over 20 years ago. I actually started in investment banking. So my first job was a summer internship at Goldman Sachs in London, and that summer turned into 10 years. So I worked for 5 more years at Goldman and then moved across to Morgan Stanley. So you might think, the kind of conventional career, lots of grads go through this standard cycle, if you like. In my case, something was different. In the early years, I was diagnosed with an inherited eye condition. It's a retinal dystrophy that I share with one of my brothers. And that meant that I was going through investment banking and really with a difference in that I started out as a so-called able-bodied employee. I say so-called because, we might talk about language later on what is normal. But I went through that experience in an industry that's quite fast-paced, quite tough, and moved eventually with Morgan Stanley over to the New York office where I worked for 5 more years. So a very interesting experience to work in that industry with a progressive disability. And it was on my mind as that time went on, what can I do about disability more generally? So eventually that's what prompted me to leave Wall Street and to venture out into the whole territory of disability. It's a very personal story for me. I felt I had experienced a lot going through that career and understanding the challenges of it as well as the opportunities. So there's both really to discuss. And that's what I put together into the course at NYU that I'm teaching this spring, which is called Disability Policy and Leadership. So we're examining disability, if you like, from the classical standpoint, what is disability? What do we mean by that word? How big of a deal is it? What does it really mean? So those are kind of the conventional questions that you'd expect to address. But then we go much deeper, and that's drawing on my own experience in Wall Street and in the private sector. What does disability mean for our leadership? Whether we are going through that experience of disability ourselves, or we're not yet going through it, because in the end, disability is actually a characteristic that is common to every single one of us sooner or later. And I think that's a very interesting lens to consider our leadership when we're in an organization of any kind. What are the things that confront us in the reality of our environment? What do we fear? What do we hide from? What do we suppress? And if we do that with disability, then what else do we do it with? And that's really one of the focuses in our course, is to consider how disability is, if you like, an invitation to explore our own leadership and our impact in whatever sector we work.
So one of the things, and I'm going to break down a little of what you said to one of the things that I mean, not one of the things, one of the many things that I truly enjoyed about our dinner a couple of days ago that was very insightful and helpful to me, and I'm sure to many of the people that will be watching this video. You have an interesting way of teaching in that you insist on meeting your students for a period of time before class starts. Why do you do that?
I do that because I think we need to introduce each other So that's very much a partnership. I need to introduce myself, my story, my background, and really what brings me to the class. And in a spirit of partnership, hear from each student individually what is their story and what brings them to the class. And sometimes there's an overlap, right? Sometimes there are students in the course at NYU this year and in prior years. And it's true in other universities where I'm teaching different modules around inclusivity. You know, there's this question that comes up, what actually brings us to this topic? And I find that in the one-to-one setting, it's much more private, it's much smaller, and it's a chance to be more, if you like, vulnerable in the sense that I get to explain to each student my own story briefly. And it hopefully sets a tone for the course, which is I really want to know what the student's story, what motivates them, what their objectives are, to the extent that they're happy to share it, right? It's not a forced conversation just because I disclose my disability and explain my motivation for teaching in this subject as part of a broader disability advocacy agenda. Doesn't mean that every student's going to necessarily say, hey, guess what, I have this health condition or I have that disability, but at least it starts the conversation, it starts the dialogue, and many students take that invitation and accept it. And some may not feel comfortable yet to disclose whatever their own family situation or personal situation is. But I think it's really important to set the tone right from the beginning, to do it in a safe way, one-to-one. And I feel the burden is on me to go first. I don't feel standing there in front of a class of 25 students telling them to be open, telling them to be more vulnerable, telling them to be willing to dialogue. For me, that doesn't work. I feel I need to start experientially, if you like, and start by role modeling this so that then students can feel, hey, you know what? I feel ready to share, ready to be open. And to be honest, Jamie, I frame the question in a very broad way. I ask my students, what can I do to make the learning environment as inclusive as possible? So that's covering everything, right? It's covering learning styles, it's covering other commitments they might have that kind of causes challenges in the class. It could cover health conditions or disabilities. So that's really my mainstream question that I like to ask, because I think in the end, we need to have inclusive classrooms. We need to have inclusive learning activities. And that covers disability, covers hopefully everything that's relevant, that's important, that helps the student get the most from the class.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned, and in thinking on the way home as I drove home, um, is anytime a student, and I was certainly one of those students, I would walk in, fear of the teacher. You know, what kind of a teacher is this teacher going to be, and so on and so forth. And here I am, NYU MBA, or the school in London MBA program, and I have this highly regarded Professor Ward, and quote unquote, not only am I scared of him, but now I'm scared, quote unquote, that he's blind, or I have a fear of the fact that
Right,
he is blind. And
right.
this seems to address that very much.
Right, right. And fear is the word, and fear is natural. It's so natural. Like it's such a natural emotion. And I'm thinking of that poem by the Sufi poet Rumi when he talks about the guest house. You know, all these different emotions come knocking on our door. You know, there's the joy, the happiness, there's the depression, the fear, and we can stand with our foot to the door and block them, or we can open the door and let's see what the message is. And I think fear is one of those messengers. It comes to us. Uh, Here's an example, right? Do you think I'm afraid walking into a class with 25 people to teach for 16 hours using 100 slides that I can't see? I mean, do you think that might be a scary thing to do? I feel it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, absolutely,
I
100%,
feel it.
a
And
hundred percent.
I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back, but I'm saying it in the sense that fear is a normal and natural emotion. And I think for me, fear is actually one of the worst disabilities of all. It's common to all of us, and it does disable us, right? We need to somehow find a way to meet our fear, to understand it, to accept it, and to try and like touch it a little bit, you know. And every time we touch it a little bit, we start to, build our own resilience, build our own courage. And I think it's true for me heading into these classes or other work that I do where sight loss is a barrier. It is an issue. It is challenging. And it's not to say we're supermen or superwomen, but you know what? Let's start with this dialogue around a topic that is fear inducing, both for people with a disability or health condition, as well as for people who don't. And I think the fear is a very common, uh, I think it's a very common reason why disability is forgotten about or conveniently ignored in the diversity and inclusion portfolio. I think it's because, and I mean, this is a fact, right? If you look at D&I programs in different sectors, industries, companies, universities, guess which characteristic often falls off the radar? Disability. It's often forgotten, often not mentioned. And I think it's because of fear. I think it's because it's one of the characteristics that, regardless of our nationality, ethnicity, religion, gender orientation, regardless of all the other characteristics, disability is the one that can impact all of us. And I have a feeling that's why it falls to the bottom of the pecking order, because it is a fear inducing thing, right? None of us want to wake up with sight loss tomorrow or hearing loss or to be, to have acquired brain injury. Anything, it's such a natural thing. But I think saying, hey, you know what, that's natural. So let's try and start. Let's start talking about it. Let's try and accept in some small way the fact that it's out there, it's reality. And if we can start to create a safe place to discuss this and to dialogue this, get rid of right and wrong, encourage an open and inclusive conversation, guess what? We've kind of listened to that message of fear. We've kind of addressed it slightly, and by degrees we can get more confident about how to disclose their disability, to be curious about disability. It really unfreezes. I think it starts to unfreeze this whole conversation. And that's very much what the course at NYU is all about. How do we unfreeze this topic? Because dialogue is the only way we're going to make progress.
So one of the things that I said when we were talking and that impressed me is you're a person that truly walks the walk. You took an idea, you put it together, and you've created a course that is very much needed at the beginning of one's career, regardless of what they're going into, to understand that you and I have, as I mentioned, we have thousands of things in common, and maybe one or two, well, two things that are different. You can probably sing, I can't sing, and you play piano, I can't play piano, and the idea that we are teaching from the outset, inclusion, sensitivity training, disability, that can help anywhere, whatever career you're going into building buildings where we need universal buildings, universal entry, where we're creating websites, whatever it may be. You're really creating one of the foundations for that. I want to go on a slight tangent with you because I truly enjoyed it. When I was first introduced to you a couple of months ago, I was told that you teach in England, you teach at NYU, and you were coming into New York, and that we would get together. We sat down to dinner, and you're from Ireland, and right away you're speaking Hebrew, and you visited Israel 11 times. Tell us how you got to Israel. How did that all start?
Ma pitom. Well, it's thanks to the venturing out, I suppose. After a few years in my career, I got the bug to go backpacking, and of course, when you're on the backpacking trail in the world, who do you think you meet? Right, lots of Israelis. And when I was in Australia for a year doing working holiday visa, that us Irish and British get to benefit from. It's there that I met Israelis for the first time, and to be frank with you, Jewish people for the first time. So, you know, we don't have a huge population of Jewish people in Ireland. This was a totally new experience for me. And, I was curious, I was curious. Obviously, growing up, I was raised Roman Catholic in Ireland. We obviously have a huge foundation of Judaism in our religious background. If you call yourself Catholic or Christian, I mean, they're in the foundation of the basement, holding the whole thing up. In my view, is Judaism. So I was curious about this, curious about the language, and started to pick up bits and pieces of Hebrew and started to try and learn a little bit myself. So this is early stage of sight loss. So it was kind of maybe a year or two when I could still read something, but it was at the same stage I was starting to lose my reading vision. So it was then going into this more listening mode, so it was listening to Hebrew. I went to a teacher, a very lovely man in London, a widower in his 80s. Aaron was his name. And he was dying to teach. And I was interested to learn. And to be frank with you, after a day of banking and long hours, I just loved how refreshingly different it was to continue learning, to learn something for me, which was quite exotic, a domino effect. And yeah, by degrees, I made trips to Israel. I had friends there, and then brought my parents there, brought my sisters there, and I just enjoyed. I think one of the things that spoke to me was the commonality with the Irish culture and the Irish situation and the Irish history. We're both small countries. We both have an experience of colonialism in many different forms. We've both had challenges in terms of conflict and peace. And we're both punching above our weight on the global stage, I would say, particularly in things like innovation and technology. We have a very special situation in terms of links with the United States, which has really helped us in many ways. And it just feels like home, and from there, I've got curious about Arabic, about Islam. I'm not really content to stay in one place. So, that's been really a doorway for me into the broader Middle East. And, in the end, something we talked about the other night, I started to realize that there is a culture of connection, a culture of relationship, a culture of curiosity in Israel and in the Middle East that I think is a very powerful weapon in our shared goal of making the world a more accessible place, a more inclusive place.
When you visited Israel, you had an opportunity to see this small nation, this startup nation, and you started meeting technologies that met
Mm.
the inclusion, the various disabilities, and so on. What did you find, let's say, in your first couple of trips, really impressive? And
What I found impressive was the that spirit of entrepreneurship. So I met the guys at Right Here, for example, and they have the indoor navigation and outdoor navigation. And I thought to myself, where did this come from? Like to have this idea that we have a problem. It's hard for people who are blind or partially sighted to navigate. It's hard outdoors, hard indoors. And to hear that they were able to not only come up with the technology, but then to trial it on entire streets in Tel Aviv, like Ibn Baral was one of the streets where they had it set up. This is a few years ago. And I thought to myself, wow, you can just almost the benefit of a smaller country, you can really make things happen. It's a fantastic laboratory. And I think it's these qualities of curiosity, right? So definitely a huge quality and a huge strength, being curious, asking why. You're like, why? Lama ze kaha, and
Right.
then the adventure, nase benishma, let's do it, this is for me is a great way of explaining a minimal viable product like MVP. Nase benishma, let's build the thing. Let's get the smallest possible viable iteration and get it out there. And then let's hear from the customers. Let's hear what works, let's hear what doesn't work. So I think there's certain qualities, that are brought to that innovation, qualities of curiosity, qualities of adventure. And I think here's a challenge too, right, for all of us. How do we listen, right? It can be hard to listen.
Right.
And God
Sure.
knows in the classroom, this is a challenge that we get as lecturers and teachers. Are we really listening to what let's say the customers are saying, whether they're students, whether they're clients, whether they're investors, whoever it might be. So I think that's one of the challenges is how do we listen? How do we find the humility to go into a conversation on whatever topic, let's say it's disability, let's say it's a new product, a new service. How do we ask the right questions and really listen? And I'll mention Paulo Freire. So there's this excellent book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So it's originating from a man in Brazil who is questioning the education system. And he talks about dialogue with humility. So he talks about how we move away from what he called the banking model of education, right? We walk into a room with all the knowledge and we just tell people, we just dispense it into the empty vessels that are in the classroom or in the meeting room, right? You could apply this to business. Or you could apply it to charity sector, right? How many charitable organizations go to blind people and tell them what's good for them?
Right.
It happens. I've had this in Ireland, I've had it in England, I've had it in America. It happens. So how do we dialogue with humility? How do we go to the room with our knowledge such as it is and create a place where we can actually share, discuss, and very importantly, ask and listen? And I think when it comes to disability awareness, that's actually a big part of progress. It's making the effort to have the conversation and being curious and listening to what people are saying.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. You met in one of the talks. You said you mentioned or used Israel as an example of how we can accomplish. Can you share on that?
Hmm. Sure. I was actually talking back in November. It was in the context of employment, and it was asking this question, right? Why do we not have more people with disabilities like me in employment? And of course, we know the benefits of employment in terms of structure and identity and security and independence. And uh, it's such a powerful and important part of our lives. So, the charity model of disability would say, hey, look at Breandan, he's losing his sight. Let's just give him a handout and let's just make sure he's happy with that. Or in fact, let's just assume he's happy with that. But employment really opens so many doors because it means we can go toe to toe with our peers in society and that we can contribute. And the question I was asking was around employment. So, Israel is working hard to increase the rate of employment of people with disabilities in all different sorts of sectors and in many places that you wouldn't expect, many traditionally so-called able-bodied kind of settings. Uh, and and really what I was exploring in my comments about Israel was really the willingness to compare ourselves, whether we're Irish or British or American, to other contexts, right? Let's just think about what other countries are doing. We don't have to argue over every single political difference, religious difference. Of course, there are differences between our countries on lots of different matters. However, let's talk about disability. Let's look and see, what do we do well in our country? What do we struggle with? And what are other people doing? So if you like, it's the classic competitor analysis that any business does. And so I feel it's important if you're a small country like Ireland or Israel, you can compare, obviously, or we can compare ourselves to each other. There's countries like Portugal that are making a tremendous impact in the disability space. So I think it's very good practice to think outside of the box, not just look internally, but actually to compare ourselves to other countries. And I think when it comes to employment, there's a lot of progress being made in countries like Israel around opening up employment opportunities to people with disabilities. Because guess what? We have huge contribution to make, and actually, the market, right from a business standpoint, the market globally for people with disabilities and their families and friends is, depending who you ask, like the size of the China, the
Right.
size of the Chinese consumer market, if not more. So actually, this is where, going back to fear disabling us, I think if we're in business today and we're kind of afraid of this thing called disability and we don't know what to do about it, so we just kind of leave it and stay away from it, we're actually putting our business at risk. You know, we're actually not seizing a huge market opportunity. So, fear does disable us. Fear disables businesses from really pursuing strategies that are sustainable and commercially viable long term. So for me, this actually turns disability on its head. We can be afraid of disability. I understand that, but actually there are huge consequences to our products and services that we offer and the markets that we explore when we ignore this real and sizable size part of our population.
I mean, we talked briefly about our webinars that we run. We know ballpark, there's approximately 1 billion people with disabilities. And obviously, at some point in our lives, as we get older, we are going to need accessibility, universal bathrooms, and the like. And we have also learned, despite you know locations on the globe, there is no border when it comes to disability. And when we have our webinars, you'll have two squares next to each other, and it's hard to believe that those two squares are next to each other on a screen and or talking to each other, let alone in the same room, which we've experienced over the last couple of weeks at various in-person
Right.
webinars. I would love for you to share with our audience is, you've explained what you do as a professor, what you're teaching, and so on. Ideally, what would you like to see with a course like yours?
Mm,
What
mm,
what would you like to see a year down the line, 5 years
right.
down the line? Because one of the things that we talked about a lot is there's a lot of organizations that do things, and then they leave the "now what" out. Now what? So
Right.
I'm challenging you, let's say, with the "now what" questions. I mean,
Right.
you have a great course going with a lot of positive vibe, which I've seen on the internet. Um, the question is, now what? What would you like to see ideally?
Right. I want disability to be on the mainstream curriculum in every university in the world. That's what I want. I want that on behalf of us, not because of some ego trip of mine. And the reason is because, right, if you ask, let's go to an Anglo-Saxon setting and ask people, when was the Battle of Hastings? People will tell you it was 1066. Now, that comes from our education system. So how is it that, we know that, right? In England, we know that. In Ireland, we probably know that too. So how come we've managed to plant this seed in people's consciousness that there was a huge battle? It happened in Hastings. It was 1066. As it happened, William the Conqueror uh, essentially conquered England, right? And this was like a watershed moment. But here's my question: how many people were disabled as a result of that battle? And
Right.
what happened to them? So if you take that analogy, imagine if we went into the curriculum, and I'm talking mainstream curriculum, right? I'm not talking about the schools of social work, education, law, medicine, where clearly disability and health condition gets covered, or hopefully it gets covered. I'm talking about the MBA programs. I'm talking about the Masters in Public Administration at NYU, where I'm teaching this course. So it's mainstream. And if we talk about disability there and we cover it there, it's a powerful upstream intervention, because at the moment, what's happening is employers of all sorts in all sectors are having to figure out what to do about disability, right? Employers are having to figure that out. So if we're investing so much time and money into education, which is such a good thing, why are we leaving this topic till, you know, the dessert part of the meal?
Right.
Shouldn't we have it on the main course, if not as a starter, you know? So there's already work. I know you mentioned Access Israel is looking at this in schools. My question is, at that, what we call higher education in England and in Ireland, how do we get disability onto the curriculum in a very deliberate way, so that we're already discussing this? We're discussing the size of the market. If it's a business school, we're discussing the needs for inclusive design. We're talking about inclusive service provision in nonprofit organizations. So we're not doing this kind of disability as an afterthought, you know, some kind of once a month, once a year, let's wear a t-shirt and say we're inclusive. Let's bring it into the curriculum, right? We're talking about integration here. Let's integrate this topic into the curriculum. And what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is suddenly there's learning through encounter. Suddenly we've had a chance to do what we're great at in universities, which is making sure we learn, we discuss, we explore, and we head out into the world as graduates with a sense as to what this thing is, right? With a sense as to potential ways that we could influence this. It's 1 billion people. We're not talking about small fry. This is big fry. So my hope is, and NYU is a start, we've got some other modules and workshops going on in other colleges and universities. The idea is really, how do we get into the mainstream education at graduate level, even at undergraduate level, so that we already start this dialogue. And my hope is, what will happen is the entrepreneurs will have this on their mind. Those budding entrepreneurs that are coming out of our schools and colleges, they'll have this on their mind. They'll already be thinking about potential solutions that none of the rest of us ever thought of. So we'll have entrepreneurs coming through. They mightn't have a disability, but they're thinking about it as their problem to help solve. We'll have entrepreneurs with disabilities and health conditions, and there's approximately 9 million of them in Europe. It's estimated 9 million entrepreneurs in Europe with a disability or health condition, right? So they're coming through feeling that this is something that they can tackle, and they're supported by society to help tackle. And then we have, you know, let's say mainstream employees, every person that walks into any organization. And guess what? When they have an employee or they have a customer or service user with a disability, it won't be the first time that they've had to deal with this issue.
What is your let's say for the next 6 months? What are your plans looking like in terms of this course and other courses?
So we have the course at NYU in the Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service, and it's really brilliant that we're able to do it there, because it shows the school's focus on this topic. It is one of many important diversity characteristics that we need to cover in the curriculum, and that's a real sign that diversity and inclusion is not a sideshow at NYU. It's increasingly integrated, and that's the whole goal, to bring this very much into the curriculum. So that's a big focus for me in the next months. There are some other workshops and modules coming up. So I'm working with a network in Ireland that's focused on inclusive research. So again, this word inclusive, it's broadening it out. It's like I said in the inclusive learning environment, how do we make research inclusive, right? So when you go to try and come up with new solutions in healthcare, for example, in health service delivery, in population health, how do you make sure you don't miss, let's say, the China issue, right? How do you not miss this huge population of people that ultimately you should be serving in healthcare research? So I'm working on some workshops over the next months in that kind of context around healthcare. And then my hope is that we gather momentum. My hope is that there will be more universities that see the impact this is having, and that there'll be more opportunities, whether it's me or me partnering with other people to get this into curriculum. It's part of my jobs. The other two jobs I do is I'm a leadership coach. So I work with leaders, and disability may or may not be part of that conversation. But I feel it's important for me to be doing that work because, well, for me, I enjoy it. I enjoy this whole confrontation with challenge, which is very much the life of my life as someone with a disability. But like, guess what? We're practiced at this, right? Who better to have looking at challenges and offering solutions, or encouraging people to consider potential solutions, than people with disabilities, right? This is what we do all day long. So I quite like the mentoring role. And in coaching, of course, you're helping people to confront their own challenges and offer signposts. So I do leadership coaching work. And then more broadly, I'm involved in advocacy around disabilities. So trying to work with employers, I'm giving keynote talks in the months ahead, trying to, positive sparks, if you like, positive sparks to get this space created where we can talk about disability and start to unfreeze the topic, because it is natural to be afraid, and I
Right.
don't wag my finger. I don't think wagging fingers is going to really unfreeze. I think it actually freezes people even more. So how can we say, look, we'll always get the language wrong. We'll never be experts. We'll never be marathon runners before we learn how to walk. So let's start. Let's start with an initial conversation. Let's start with some focus groups. Then let's see, by degrees, how can we start to bring disability in a more integrated way into our organization? And that's kind of what I do alongside the teaching work, is trying to figure out downstream in employment, how can I help employers to unfreeze this conversation?
And the beauty of it also is you're introducing it right at the floor one,
Right.
before these guys go out into the open world and create what
Right.
they think is good for disability, rather than someone who's in the position of knowledge to teach them, what disability, what inclusion, and what a world should look like, a universal world should look like. So
Mm-hmm.
I want to close with the conversation, how our conversation started and how you broke the ice. I mean, I knew a little about you. I knew that you taught at NYU, and the waitress brought the menu, and your first question to her was, "Do you have?"
Malawach.
There you go. And then I said, "How do you know how to say? First of all, how do you know what Malawach was, and how do you pronounce it so well?" And that was just a powerful, powerful, like, talk about break the ice. This guy can do chetz better than I do chetz, which is
Well,
quite impressive.
I have my friend Shahar in Petah Tikva to thank for that, because when we were traveling in Thailand, so I had never had Israeli food until I was in Thailand, and sure enough, in Bangkok, with the mobs of Israelis passing through, there are Israeli restaurants. So Shahar introduced me, and he gave me the whole lowdown on shakshuka, on malawach, on jachnun, and oh, I couldn't get enough of it. So much so that when he went on to meet his brother in Laos, I was in Thailand on my own for a while. I went back there. I'm sure they didn't have many Irish people walking in saying, "Give me some malawach." But I love eating. I love food, and yeah, I had my first taste of malawach in Bangkok. So yeah, I didn't have it with you the other night, but the schnitzel was very good.
There you go. I tell our speakers that our audience out there is people, the 18s and over. But we do send out these emails to a lot of grade schools, to a lot of kids who
Mm,
are let's say 10 to 15 years old, if there was a message that you wanted to deliver to them pre-college about disabilities, about inclusion,
Mm.
what would you say to them?
Every single one of us have different abilities and different needs, and that's everyone. So just because there's a medical diagnosis for my sight loss or for any other thing that the viewers and listeners might have, that in the end, all it means is we have different needs. We have different needs, but who doesn't have different needs in the end? And also, who doesn't have different abilities? So, while it might feel in the more medical model that we're different, abnormal, inferior, it's simply not true. It's simply not true. Being disabled is something that we choose. We can choose to be disabled by fear. We can choose to be disabled by sight loss or other diagnoses. I'm not denying the reality. God knows it gets on me. I get tired. I get exhausted. I get sad. But what keeps me going is the knowledge that every single person in this world, irrespective of country, creed, background, have every single person has different abilities and different skills. And what we need to do is figure out what our needs are and give ourselves permission to ask for them, to have them fulfilled. Right, I need help to go running, I need a guide, I ask for a guide. I need help in the store, I ask for help. And that is tiring, but we give ourselves permission to ask for what we need and make sure that we show up with all the abilities we do have, of which there are many. So do not reduce yourself to a label of blind or disabled or anything like that. Everyone in this world is disabled by something, and it is our choice. We get to choose how we show up. We get to choose who to ask for support with our needs and how we offer our abilities, which are different, right? They're different, but that's the power of diversity. That's the power of being in this thing together. And my advice would be never forget your needs are things you can ask for support with, whatever they are, disabled or otherwise. And your abilities are your gifts to share and to shine, like a light to the nations, which is maybe a tagline for Access Israel, right? We each have a chance to be a light that shines to others. And that's my wish for us and all of us.